just in the centre of Kyiv, and you can hear the long drone of the air raid siren. You can hear it rise and fall there. And that's the sound the Ukrainians have been hearing since the beginning of the war in February, the air raid siren that tells everybody to get indoors. And it's quite an eerie thing to hear for the first time. There we are. My name is David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest from Kyiv.
I'm Sophie Coe. It's Thursday, the 28th of July, day 155. Our usual host, David Knowles, and our defence and security editor, Dom Nicholls, are currently in Ukraine. This week we'll be hearing from them as they meet prominent Ukrainian politicians, visit some significant locations from the war so far, and speak to those who are experiencing the struggle firsthand to hear their stories.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Today, I was joined in our London newsroom by the Telegraph's assistant comment editor, Francis Durnley, whilst David dialed in from a market in central Kyiv. Dom Nicholls also joined with a very special guest, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister. I started by asking David to paint a picture for us of lunchtime in central Kyiv.
Hi everybody, I hope you can hear me all right. I'm just outside Kyiv Food Market, which is an incredibly sort of upmarket and snazzy food hall quite close to the river Dnieper here in Kyiv. It's a beautiful day. I'm sitting outside. Just been basically sitting here sort of talking to quite a few people. Just met Anna Vertsan for lunch, and we had a very good chat ahead of Dom and I heading back, so that was absolutely lovely. Later meeting Ilya, our translator, for my translator yesterday in Bucha, again just to talk to him a little bit more about his background and say thank you for his help. And so I'll sort of just be here really until we have to go back to the hotel and then head to the station, I think. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's a beautiful day here in Kyiv. It's odd. I'll be completely honest. We had an air raid siren this morning, which you could hear across the city, and then 20 minutes later, people are just as calm, going around their daily lives, going for lunch, meeting their friends. There's people are just having to, as Anna put it, really, there's just sort of you've got to get through it, and live a normal life as possible. So that's what I've been seeing this morning. And
just switching back to that moment where you heard the air raid siren this morning, what was it like?
Well, I saw the telegram notification on my phone, and sort of opened the window of the hotel just to see, and you can just hear it in the distance. You can hear it. It was quite far away, and it's a quite high tone, which then decreases at the end. So it's very, very distinctive, and. Yeah, immediately. I mean, actually, this one didn't last for very long. We got the all clear sort of 20 minutes later, by which time I was sort of on the ground floor and heading out. But it was an incredibly eerie thing. I mean, it's not a sound you want to hear, frankly. It's really not. Then to go from that to the food market, and as I said, people just going around their daily life it's a quite. You get a sense of just how courageous everybody has to be, every single man, woman, and child here, because this is the reality of their lives. They're trying to live as normally as possible, under threat of attack every single day.
Totally. And talking about people living their normal lives, listeners on our podcast will have already heard a dispatch from you after a dinner you had in Kyiv last night. Can you tell us a bit more about the local food that you ate there?
So I'll say, Ukrainian cuisine is absolutely incredible. The Ukrainians take their food very, very seriously. We had some raw pork called salas, which you have after vodka. We had fresh tomatoes, large ripe tomatoes, some onion. We had all manner of different sorts of dumplings with meat, some sweet, some with cherries inside. This was accompanied by some homemade vodka from our host, and he was telling us how it's very, very normal in Ukraine for the grandparents to make you some vodka. And I put a picture of it, on my Instagram story, because it's a different colour. We Brits imagine vodka as being, clear like water, and this is actually brown because it's homemade. And that was quite something. And it was delicious, frankly. So yeah, I mean, the food here is. I think there's we've interviewed 2 chefs for this podcast over the 5 months. Over the 5 months we've been doing it, 5-6 months, and I'm starting to understand why the Ukrainians really care about their food, and it's some of the best I've tasted in Europe, frankly.
And away from the food, the people that you were having dinner with, what did they say about the limits to which they have on their normal lives now, and what extent life in Kyiv is normal at the moment?
Yeah, it's odd because we're talking, these two young guys, I think 25 and 27, I believe, and so it's a very normal conversation. Talking about life in London, life in Kyiv, and then suddenly the war comes in. We heard a sound in the distance, so everybody goes over to the window to see what it was. Was that a missile? And then we return to dinner. Something of course we all know is that every single Ukrainian kind of knows where they were at the beginning of the war, knows what they did, knows how they reacted. And that moment is burnt on everybody's minds. So we've heard now many different stories of how people reacted and what they did. And Alexander, who was telling us how in the first first days of the war, when the call went up to mobilise, the recruitment centre was full of people, and that experience of being there with hundreds of other people, ordinary people, some as old as in the 60s and 70s, had come to fight, to come to defend their city. Was incredibly moving, and how he was trying to find his place and find his role and what he could do to help his fellow countrymen. Also we were in a district called Obolon, which is to the north of Kyiv. It's a sort of Soviet with a capital S. It's high rise apartments and sort of clustered together. And they were saying, how in the early weeks that this was, the Russians nearly got as far as Obolon. What they did, there's an APC which got lost and had to be tracked down by the Ukrainians. So even in this district had seen some action in the early weeks of the war. And this is just an ordinary residential street, ordinary residential district. Nothing. I mean, it's crazy to be there and just look out of your window and they saw a Russian tank and they can point out what they saw. So it's quite a humbling experience, really, talking to people. As I said, everybody has a story.
Definitely. Thank you, David. And the reason, obviously, that we've heard that the possible reason for the air raid siren going off this morning is this kind of heightened tension after the counterattacks, which we've been discussing for the last few days in the Kherson region. Now, Francis, I'm wondering if you could give us the latest updates from Kherson over the last 24 hours since we last spoke on this podcast.
Certainly. Great to hear from David. Glad that all's well with him, and look forward to hearing from Dom shortly. So, yes, the Ukrainian counterattack, we understand, has virtually cut off the Russian-occupied southern city of Kherson and left thousands of Russian troops stationed near the Dnieper River. The British MOD has said that Ukrainian forces are, quote, gathering momentum, close quote, and have used new long-range artillery to damage at least 3 of the bridges crossing the Dnieper. Quote, Russia's 49th Army, stationed on the west bank of the Dnieper River, now looks highly vulnerable, it said. So quite significant developments there. The loss would severely undermine Russia's attempts to paint the occupation as a success. Again, that's according to the British analysis of the military developments. We've got a very interesting piece by our regular on this podcast, Roland Oliphant, who's written about the significance of the Battle of Kherson and how it will test Ukraine, but it won't necessarily be the end of the war if the campaign goes successfully. And there's some interesting quotes that I plucked out, but I highly recommend that people read it in full. So one thing that he says is that the next step after this campaign in Kherson would be, and to destroying the bridges, would be to deplete the Russian air defences in the area to allow Ukrainian drones and ground attack jets to operate. Russian commanders, of course, would then face the same choice that the Ukrainians faced in the Luhansk region, whether they stay and fight or order a retreat early enough to avoid encirclement and potential disaster. So that's what we're looking at in the sort of long-term picture around the significance of this counterattack. He also goes on and says that Ukrainian advances so far have been small-scale probing attacks. We're yet to see whether they have the superiority in infantry, armour and artillery to mount conventional offensive against dug-in positions. So it's still very early days, early hours indeed of this counterattack, but it would appear that the Ukrainians are laying the groundwork for what could be a substantial campaign. But that's the latest on the military question and around Kherson.
So obviously we've spoken about the Ukrainian counterattack. Now that has come with some news about the impact that the war is now having on Russian troops, that we finally got some figures. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, we're hearing that more than 75,000 Russians have been killed or injured in the war in Ukraine so far, according to classified estimates from the Biden administration. If those numbers, of course, are true, then they are, I think it's fair to say, considerably higher than we may well have expected. So this classified briefing, which has first been reported by CNN, was provided to lawmakers in the House of Representatives. And if, as I say, that figure is accurate, it would mean that approximately half the number of Russian troops committed to the war effort have been killed or injured during the war so far. Western officials have previously suggested, of course, that as many as 150,000 Russian troops had been thrown at the invasion. Now, we've talked in the past on this podcast numerous times about attrition rates, casualty rates, and how those can impact a country's capacity to fight. And indeed, those kind of casualty figures would be considerably higher than would be sustainable in a long-term campaign. So something would have to change. Either Putin would have to mobilize more forces, or he would have to adapt tactics even further to reduce casualties. So that's the sort of broad brush significance of all this. As I say, the British MOD have said in their update that from their perspective, the Russian army looks highly vulnerable. That's their quote. So, of course, this latest information on Russian losses would speak to that.
Certainly, and it reminds me of something that Vitaly Klitschko said when he was on this podcast and Twitter space earlier this week, where he said, it's a terrible disaster for Ukraine, but it's also a terrible disaster for the Russians, and he's waiting for them to realise that. And I would recommend, obviously, listeners, if you didn't hear Vitaly Klitschko on the podcast earlier this week, then do go and listen back to that interview with David and Dom, because when he said that, I think it really hits home, and when we see these figures, it brings the message home even more. Now, I think we might have Dom Nicholls soon, but I'm quickly going to ask you first, Francis, about the new news we had today from the UK's National Security Advisor, who made some quite strong suggestions about nuclear war.
Yes, so there's been a very interesting briefing by Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who is very senior here in terms of security. He's actually the UK's National Security Advisor. And he said that the West and China could, as things stand, quote, miscalculate their way into nuclear war. He said that Britain has clear concerns about Beijing's expanding and modernising of its nuclear arsenal, adding that China's, quote, disdain, close quote, for arms control agreements was a daunting prospect. And it's clear that this is a signal of a hardening UK position on China, one that we've already talked about at length this week. He's warning, essentially, that the world may no longer have the Cold War safeguards that prevented nuclear war with the USSR in the Cold War over the course of those decades. And consequently, there are more risks here. And of course, what he's talking about here are things like the telephone that connected Moscow to the White House, that was introduced after the Cuban Missile Crisis between Khrushchev and JFK, and numerous other diplomatic channels that were always open to avoid dangerous escalation. And so I think I don't want to alarm listeners and think, this basically means that there's nuclear war is imminent or something like that. That's not the case, and that's not what he's saying. But what he's saying is that in the Cold War there was an understanding of between powers of the dangers of nuclear escalation. But because we're living in a sort of post-Cold War world, we may well be developing new weapons, building up capacity when those safeguards are no longer present. So I think that's the essence of what he's saying here. But as I say, it should be read in the context of a broadening strengthening of the British and NATO position around the threat posed by China and other autocratic regimes, of which Russia, of course, is one, who have essentially entangled themselves in the world economy and in numerous ways with energy provision and all sorts. I mean, healthcare as well. And this is now, I think, a part of a process that we're seeing of that disentanglement. But of course, when one is so entangled with an economy like China's that produces 40% or 50% of the world's manufacturing, it is not something you can reverse overnight. And not only that, it's something that would have severe economic ramifications. I mean, we've talked at length on this podcast about the severe damage that's being wrought in Europe by Putin turning off the taps on energy. But you imagine how much more extrapolated that would be if it were on all elements of manufacturing, if this was to happen with China, if, say, they were to invade Taiwan. So this is the broader strategic picture here, and this is why I think it's relevant to bring China up in this discussion, is that Ukraine has acted as the sort of prime mover of a different way of thinking about global security now, and it has broken down the consensus that dictated the years and the decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 1990s, and we're seeing a broader reflection in the West now as a result, and so I think it should be read, as I say, in that context.
And this again plays into the leadership battle going on in the UK at the moment, because we know that Liz Truss is kind of hawkish on her view of China.
Absolutely. So Liz Truss, of course, being one of the leadership contenders to succeed Boris Johnson, the current Foreign Secretary, she has been a much more vocal critic of China, arguably more so than anyone else in the cabinet. And so, yes, if she does become Prime Minister, I think we can see the start, at least, of quite significant untangling, as I say, of Chinese involvement in Britain. Just like across Europe, of course, China has been heavily invested in energy services here. I believe Hinkley Point is quite substantially invested, owned by Chinese investment. And of course, there are concerns about what that might mean about energy security. There's also an enormous amount of investment into university sectors. So a lot of universities have opened up Chinese research centres funded by big Chinese donors. And there have been concerns about sort of censorship, that there have been sort of certain things that have been done to appease the Chinese state to enable this funding and research funding as well. So all sorts of things now are being, I think, reconsidered and will be reconsidered if Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister. I'm not saying that wouldn't be the case under Rishi Sunak if he were to succeed, but it would appear that he has been slightly more concerned, I think it's fair to say, about the implications of triggering sort of a trade war with Europe or with broader world powers, because obviously he's a former chancellor and he knows the economic consequences of doing that. But certainly it's been fascinating to see this shift on China in recent weeks. As I say, not only in Britain, in NATO, very, very strong words indeed. And I think that this will be one of the big, if not even more significant offshoots of the war in Ukraine, will be how China is considered by the West. It will no longer be a sort of I think a trading power in the manner that it was. This is a wake-up call.
Thank you so much, Francis. Now, I believe we're going to be joined imminently by our Defence and Security Editor, Dom Nicholls, who is in the office of the Ukraine's Deputy PM, Olga Stefanishyna. So, Dom, am I right in saying that we can hand over to you and Olga now?
Yeah, hi Sophie, hi everybody. That's right. I'm in the office of Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister, Olga Stefanishyna, responsible for European integration and Euro-Atlantic affairs. And I'd just like to spend a few minutes here with the Deputy PM talking about the role of the office and the challenges. I mean, it's, as we've said many times on this podcast, a lot of the reasons seemingly for this war is Vladimir Putin's irrational fury at not willing to see a successful, prosperous, sovereign, economically viable former Soviet state on his borders, and European integration and that relationship with the US and with NATO is absolutely central to that. So I think it'll be a fascinating chance to introduce this topic and hear from Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah, with that. Deputy PM, very thank you very much indeed for having us here. Welcome to the Telegraph's Twitter space and podcast. And as I just said, if you wouldn't mind just spending a couple of moments, first of all, to sort of explain your role here, what the office is, and what it's set up for, how it docks into your government.
Okay, thank you so much. Indeed, it's very important to reach a broad audience in explaining something which plays a crucial role in Ukraine and in issues related to European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Okay, so European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and basically this mandate I had even before the full-scale war, which started on 24/7, has been mostly targeted to reach the goal enshrined in the Constitution to gain the full membership in EU and NATO as a strategic goals of Ukrainian foreign and internal policy. And of course, after the beginning of the full-scale war, all of us immediately in the first minute where we heard the shelling and the bombing of the cities around Ukraine, our mandates has been immediately transformed to the mandates of ministers of victory. So we had to do everything we can to make sure that we can, by our efforts, contribute to ending this war and restoring peace and sovereignty on our land and prevailing of the democracy. So over the first days after the 24th of February, I've been doing literally everything from handling humanitarian stuff to negotiating the military support to Ukraine to whatever I could reach, and of course prioritizing the cooperation with NATO on issues on the exchange of information and exchange of data, and coordinating the efforts on the non-military support which has been provided by NATO to Ukraine. But it came very crystal clear on the fifth day of war when we submitted the application for membership to European Union that the key to the victory of Ukraine is in making global decision, because the full-scale war is of course taking place on our soil, but this is the war which is for much more global issues than just like the territorial issues. This is about the rules, this is about the values, this is about the impossibility to make military invasions to a peaceful, independent and sovereign country. And we understood that every hour on Ukrainian battlefield, we're writing the new global history. And we made this decision to apply for membership in European Union for two reasons. First, we understood that with such neighbor like Russia, you can have 24th of February anytime. We are lucky to have these 8 years of transformations, which set in stone many reforms. And the application for membership was first and foremost to make the decision to recognize the aspiration of Ukrainian people. And it has been done. And then granting the candidate status for Ukraine has been a legal commitment of all EU member states that we will stand together until the very last moment the war is over, and then we will stand together afterwards, and then we will become part of the family. We will be sitting over the table, because this is the place we're fighting for. And this has basically transformed all of my mandate, which I had before 24th of February, to something which is an essential part of the victory we had, and that brings a lot of new energy into everything I do. I have a relatively small office in the government, but basically I have a huge army of politicians and the leaders of different institutions who prioritize now European integration. And the surrealistic understanding is that literally we're operating under the shellings and bombings. Now it's like relatively more calm in Ukraine, but the effectiveness of our operation is 10 times more efficient than it was before 24th of February. And of course, President of Ukraine has become not only the chief of the command, but also he's the chief of the European command. He's the leader of this policy. And today we celebrate the National Statehood Day. And while he was addressing to the nation, he said that basically today is the day when our European track becomes part of the internal policy. And this becomes the path towards preparing our country to the victory and the reforms we will be doing throughout that. So the transformation of my mandate after war is now to coordinate internal reforms in a country in various sectors to make sure that by the moment we win the war, we are ready, prepared to rebuild our country and build Ukraine back better and closer to European Union.
And in those early days of the war, when you reached out to the international community, I'm thinking particularly Europe, but the international community more broadly, were you surprised at the response you received, either surprised good or surprised disappointed?
Well, there's been a lot of inspiration and frustration, to be frank, in speaking with different leaders of international organization, ministers, and leaders of the government of various countries across the world, not only in Europe. Basically, a lot of politicians and leaders reached the president, reached also me personally, just like 4:30 in the morning when the war just started. So I was here in my office already at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I already received a lot of phone calls with the people just calling me, like the ministers and some of the colleagues from the NATO and EU institutions. They were just calling by asking a question: what can we do? So this was not something like we were reaching. They were reaching back to me personally, asking how can they help. And we were ready. We were preparing to this kind of scenario to the extent we could. Of course, we couldn't imagine that this would be a full-scale military attack throughout all of the territory of Ukraine, including Kiev. But we knew what we need in terms of military support. We knew what we need in terms of mobilizing the unity, let's say, the so-called anti-Putin, anti-war coalition. And we were extremely coordinated. So, but there's been a lot of frustration as well. In my communication with some of the colleagues, I've been in contact for years and for months, and I thought that this has been the, let's say, the most trustworthy and understanding partners, but they came up to be a bit of distancing from taking the decision and hiding behind bureaucracy, and it really literally caused tears on my eyes when I heard that, just like making some calls like after the shelling of the theater in Mariupol and hearing like this cold voices of people trying to distance themselves, from that. That has been the case. But the positive things is that our energy and dedication really caused transformation, even in the most cold-hearted leaders.
And what do you put that distance and the cold heart, as you describe it, down to? The war took, I think, almost everybody by surprise, including the Russian army. So I'm prepared to give a bit of the benefit of the doubt here to domestic politicians and leaders who were just shocked, who just could not believe it and spent some time to get over that. But they've had enough time now. So do you put it down to domestic politics or a genuine unwillingness, as the suggestion has been from some countries such as Germany and France, to challenge the order of Europe at the moment and the relationship with Russia because of the economic costs as we're seeing through gas and what have you? Why do you think there was that cold-hearted response? And if you're prepared to sort of give me an indication, north, south, east, or west, that would be delightful.
Well, I'm not about like giving the indications. It would be extremely frustrating to those cold-hearted people to hear that. I guess, but I would definitely write memoirs where I will put everybody like personally to that understanding. I would say it took us quite a while to mobilize the broader global understanding that none of the existing conventional mechanisms had been helpful in terms of preventing this war, as well as none of the existing conventional mechanisms could stop the war. We can, and that took us quite a time. So there's been a discussion where maybe you can have the negotiations, maybe you can, just adhere to some ultimatums. But immediately after that, the understanding came that it's not about the negotiations. It's just about not legitimizing everything which has been happening. And of course, when we were speaking about the terrible war crimes taking place on our soil since the first literally days of the war, we were not heard until the whole world had seen the pictures from Bucha and Irpin. So there's been a lot of sort of inertia, thinking that maybe bureaucracy or some instruments could be helpful in terms of acting somehow. Everybody understood that some actions should be taken, and there were not always a willingness to get the personal commitment, the political leadership to take some actions. Some of the leaders, some of the ministers tried to hide behind the bureaucracy. But it has never been the case, and we understand now that we have mobilized this unity, this energy of leadership to stop and to deter Russia. But it took us quite time. And just the last element, some of the international organizations like UN, handling the wars is their business, to be frank, and Russia has been in this business. With all the wars on this earth, basically, with the United Nations. So they're extremely advanced in utilizing the infrastructure of the UN system. So, this goes also to the International Red Cross Organization, who has to stick for the Geneva Conventions and to act appropriately. But they never knew that Ukraine will not play these shadow games. So when I saw the information about the crimes committed, when I saw the bodies of those children and those civilians who has been facing this war, and I heard these stories, I couldn't hear this cold-hearted people. I wasn't care about any conventional or unconventional mechanism. I've been pushing for the necessity to act. And this has changed the situation. This has changed the situation dramatically, and the leaders have started to act in a way which would lead to result. So the Ramstein format has been established. The G7 coordination on sanctions has been established. These all the formats of the leaders taking the decision.
I would like to ask you in a moment about the bureaucracy. You say some countries have been hiding behind, and wonder if an element of that is the requirement to join the EU, and where Ukraine might have to prioritise some areas. For example, the issue of corruption in government. But I'll come back to that in a moment. But because you touched on one of my personal hobby horses there, the United Nations, I think the United Nations should have done more, should be in a position to do more. When Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General, was here 2 months ago, were these points presented to him either in front of the cameras or behind?
Yes, it has been presented to him personally, and it's been publicly communicated by us throughout of the way, and it played its role basically in changing the situation. I can also not go into very details of this process, but I think the whole world came up to know about Ukraine. A couple of things. First is, of course, our resilience and resistance, and second, how skillful and professional Ukrainian administration is, and that we kept on operating even throughout the war, and that we are not in a position to be let's say manipulated with. So we knew that we have a war. We knew that there are international organizations having a specific mandate, and we required them to deliver on their mandate. And if they were not delivering on that or manipulating by Ukrainians somehow, we were vocal about that, and that played its role. So EU, as you now see, Secretary General Guterres has took the lead on the food security crisis. This has been a position of Ukraine that UN has to deliver at least on a part of its mandate on humanitarian response. The same about the role of the International Red Cross Organization, which has been very, let's say, blurry in the beginning of the war. Now it's been absolutely clear. So and things became more effective, I would say.
And just before we move on, to stick with the UN for a moment. So you say that UN deserves credit for the grain deal last week. When you look at the fine detail of some of the agreements there, it can be suggested it is somewhat soft on Russia, i.e. there is no mechanism really under the agreement to say, well, hang on, the grain that you are trying to export Russia is from Ukraine. I mean, that bit of moving the grain to the ports to then get out, that seems to be a little bit fudgy. Is that fair? Do you think the UN are honest brokers here and are going to hold Russia to account, not only to allow grain out, but allow all of your grain out through your ports?
We praise the leadership of Mr. Gutierrez in having this deal. But as we were communicating from the very beginning, we do not have any illusions on Russia and on Russia commitment or sticking to any agreement. And it's a bit unfortunate to us to hear no reaction from the UN following the fact that next day, after the deal has been signed, two Russian rockets were shelled to the Odessa city port, to the grain storages, which has been part of the deal. So, and this is the port which is in the center of the city. It's in the center of Odessa, and they reached their goals. And no reaction followed by that. So it really, let's say, puts a question mark on whether this deal is manageable, whether the efforts UN and Turkey will take to that regard will be enough to release the grain. On our side, we made a clear statement that we stick to our obligations. So we do our part in terms of technical preparedness, but we do not have any illusions on sticking to this arrangement by Russia. And in fact, we require a strong reaction and additional sanctions over Russia because they're stealing the grains from the ports with Azov Sea, the grains and the metal scrap. So they simply stealing, revealing these products and selling them to the third countries' markets. So it's absolutely unacceptable, and this should be also recognized and condemned.
So you have question marks over the deal. Do you also have question marks over the UN's ability to operate at this level in the modern world, where a P5 member of the UN Security Council has invaded another country?
I think that this is exactly the exam UN now is passing. Okay, we now understand that with Russia on the Security Council having a seat, it's rather complicated to, let's say, seek for any role UN can play in ending the war. Okay, so we're putting it behind the brackets, right? But UN has been developing a huge infrastructure of organizations related to humanitarian response for Africa, for Asia, for various parts of the world. And now when UN itself stating that 20% of the world population would be affected by the food crisis caused by the Russian war, UN has to mobilize each and every instrument they have to unblock it. And if they're not able to do it, so UN is unable to exist then.
Now, one of the issues that is very quickly grabbed by those who might want to stymie, slow down or stop Ukraine's membership or accession to the EU is corruption. How are you addressing the issues that have been presented to you about this area of political activity in your country?
Well, I wouldn't say I don't like. I would rather say I hate when we're associated with the corruption, because what we do right now, and even within the recommendations of European Commission, is just like we're closing the leftovers of the whole anti-corruption reform. So it's not like we have a corruption. Like we had a lot of like elements for the petty corruption when people and citizens has to reach the officials for various services, for various documents and etc. But I can speak of myself, so I haven't seen any public official for anything I need to reach the government services. Everything is fully digitalized. We have a purely transparent all the elements of the public procurement in the government, so you can trace each and every like part of the paper bought by government, but we still have a lot of leftovers. So we've approved the legislation on so-called anti-oligarch legislation, which makes it public that some of the substantially financed business industries have the influence to the media or to the political life or financing political parties. This is the element of transparency we should end. And also we have already completed basically the selection for the prosecutor of the anti-corruption prosecution office. So he has been appointed today, and we closed this let's say part. And also we announced the competition for the director of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and the mandate of the previous director expired like some time ago when the war has been already there. So we're just closing the leftovers, but largely our state, if we're applying it to an ordinary citizen, right, like operates in a very digital way. Everything is transparent, and all the registers we have and data, they're also open. So there's been a lot of manipulations in that regard, and we understand what are the elements. I mean, triggering this as a bell over us, and we're working on that. So, and we will deliver very well by October. But I think that one of the crucial moments when the decision to grant Ukraine candidate status was done, despite of these concerns on anti-corruption, not ended the judiciary reform, was the message we were sending, that you should finally start trusting Ukraine. Because in a time when Russia manipulates with gas, with energy, when Russia tries to undermine nearly every value that we've been cherishing for years and decades, Ukraine has been showing that we are a trustworthy and reliable partner. The last three energy and gas crises, which has been taking place in Europe, has gave no sign that Ukraine is not delivering on its obligation. We remain trustworthy partners as in issues of gas transit. We have managed to integrate into EU electricity market on a 10th day of war, basically. And we, in a time of war, when electricity infrastructure has been severely damaged, remain a reliable partner within electricity market of European Union. So, and there's a lot of other elements, like even 6.5 million of Ukrainian people who fled to European Union, but none of these people has caused any kind of complexities and problems in being placed in such a huge amount among the territory of European Union. So you should see us in the way we are, and you should finally start trusting us. We do our job on our side. We understand what's need to be done to tick these boxes in terms of the rule of law generally. We do it, but also the whole world should start looking at us in a bit of different way.
And just moving on to my final area, how close are you to EU membership and NATO membership? Are you on the track you would hope to be? What challenges are left? And do you think the closer you get to these institutions, that actors such as Vladimir Putin, and there will be others, will ramp up the language about its escalatory, it's provocative, and try and undermine the security aspects of Europe in order to stymie your application?
Well, basically, Putin now is a younger brother. Russia now is a younger brother of China, basically, and Russia is not something which should be treated. A country or this regime or Kremlin should not be treated as something that threatens to somebody. Basically, the only thing which has not been used on our soil throughout this time of war is the nuclear weapon. Everything the world has seen only after the Second World War and throughout the Second World War has been already taking place on our soil for this 155 days. So no threats are applicable. No threats are to put any hesitation in decisions taken towards Ukraine or towards Ukrainian aspirations. And we see that basically Putin himself over these days has busted all of the myths he's been raising and cherishing for years. Now you see that Sweden and Finland has become members of NATO, and the border with NATO has between NATO and Russia has increased for more than 2,000 square kilometers. And this narrative is not applicable to that, to this country. So this is not something somebody should reflect at all. And basically, in 2014, when we had the Revolution of Dignity, it was because of the pressure from Russia not to sign with the signature of the association agreement. We did it. We implemented it. We're top 20 importers to European Union, and basically the war which started on 24th of February is not something that because we have a free trade area with the European Union. So we should stop this policy of strategic ambiguity towards Russia, because this policy only allows Russia to grow up in this paranoia, let's say.
Olga Stefanishyna, Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, thank you very much for talking to The Telegraph.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Dom Nicholls and Olga Stefanishyna, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, just there. Amazing to hear from her. Francis, I wondered if you had any reactions to Dom and Olga's conversation there. I mean, we could speak for hours on it, but if you could have just one thought, what would it be?
Yes, well, it was really fascinating hearing her analysis there towards the end on this question of the charge of corruption in Ukraine, how this is often being used as a weapon against further European integration of that country. And I think she made a very interesting observation there by saying that it didn't stop further integration of Russia, which of course we know has been a country ruled by a kleptocracy and oligarchs for decades now. That didn't stop them. So why is this sort of suddenly being used as a barrier for Ukraine? And then, of course, she went on to talk about all of the initiatives that they've launched to try and tackle what has been a systemic issue in Ukraine's past. So I thought that was an incredibly interesting comment, and one that no doubt will need sort of further analysis and by us here at the paper, but also by sort of foreign policy people around the world, because that clearly is a very, very good point, and I think she made it very eloquently.
Definitely. And what did you make of her discussions around Ukrainian corruption?
Well, I thought she clearly, given the depth of her response and the duration in which she spoke about it, they clearly see it as a major issue. This wasn't something when Dom asked the question that she was able to sort of, or felt that she could sort of just dismiss. She, I think, addressed it for about 6 or 7 minutes, if not more, talking about the initiatives, talking about and acknowledging that it was an issue in the past, and then making this point, as I say, that Russia has and other countries' practices have been such that it hasn't led to issues in the past of countries like Russia being integrated in the energy apparatus of Europe. And so, you know, it's a bit rich now, I think was her point, reading between the lines. She's saying it's a bit rich now for countries now to be using this as a means not to further integrate the Ukrainian economy and politically into the European project, when, of course, it hasn't been a barrier for other countries that have known to be corrupt, that have known to be seizing and annexing territory, which of course Russia did in 2014. So, as I say, I thought that was a very interesting observation, and of course all of her commentary as well at the beginning, talking about the current political situation around the United Nations as well. Lots of things to digest there, and no doubt there'll be many listeners who listen to it and think, oh, I need to re-listen to that, because there was a lot of things to digest.
Definitely, and I should say before we go that we have a very jam-packed week of interviews, and this will not stop on Friday. It will continue into next week, where we'll have Dom and David back in London, and we'll be hearing their reflections on their time in Ukraine. And now, Francis, you have a final thought, so I'm going to hand over to you.
I do have a final thought, Sophie. Now, obviously, this podcast isn't about us, far from it. But before we go, I think listeners should be aware that this is actually Sophie's last day on the podcast and her last week at The Telegraph. It goes without saying that, Sophie, you've been an enormous part of this podcast since it began following the invasion. You've been not only presenting it in David's absence, but you've been an enormous part of the production team. A lot of work goes into producing every episode of this, and Sophie's been at the very forefront of that for months now. So on behalf of us, of course, here at The Telegraph, but also the millions now of listeners who've heard your voice over recent months, thank you for all of your hard work.
Quick thing from me, obviously, Sophie, well done. Thank you for all of your hard work and best of luck in your next role. Do everybody follow Sophie Coe. She's going to be an absolute star. Well, she already is.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening. It has been the honour of my career doing this podcast, the best thing I've ever done. And I'm so thankful to David and Dom and Francis and Louisa and Giles behind the scenes and all the social team at The Telegraph as well. I'm going to name Carla, Sophie, Jaden and Gemma, who do all of the production behind the scenes. So yes, as Francis said, this is very much not about us. I might be going, but the podcast does not stop. And as we said, it will keep going until Ukraine is a free country once again. Ukraine, the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. David and Dom aim to join us every day, live from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. We're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world, and if you're in Ukraine, keep an eye out for our 2 intrepid reporters. Thanks to Louisa Wells, Giles Gear, and Carla Abreu for producing this episode.